Okay, welcome everyone. As always, I want to thank Dot for putting this together. I really appreciate it. Dot told me that you were interested in the book of Numbers, the book of Bamidbar. So that is what we're going to learn tonight. And of course, it's an entire book, so there's only so much we can do. But I want to introduce the idea of the book and its meaning, and especially the first two portions, which in English we call the book of Numbers. But in Hebrew, the word is very different than Numbers. It's Bamidbar, which means in the desert. Now, if we look at the 5 books of Moses, it's interesting that some of the books, when translated into English, are a very close approximation to the name of the book in Hebrew. But other times it's not. Let's go through them. The first one we call Genesis. In Hebrew, it's Bereshit. Bereshit means in the beginning, and Genesis means the beginning. So that's a very close translation. But the book of Exodus in Hebrew is Shemot, which means names. So it's very different. Exodus is definitely the theme of the book, coming out of Egypt, the Exodus from Egypt. But in Hebrew, the name of the book is Names. I'm not going to explain why that is right now. The next book is, in English, Leviticus, from the word Levi, the tribe of Levi, because it had to do very much with the priests and their service in the tabernacle. But in Hebrew, it's Vayikra, and he called. Now, all of this is just to bring us to the book of Numbers. Now, again, the beginning of this book, there's a lot of numbers. That's one of the things we want to explain tonight. But in Hebrew, it's Bamidbar, which means in the desert. So it's a very different word than Numbers. Numbers is the theme of, let's say, the first 2 portions, but really, the theme of the whole book is the idea in the desert, because this book begins in the 2nd year after leaving Egypt, and the famous 40 years that we wandered in the desert, most of it is taking place in this book. So it's all about being in the desert for 40 years. Now, what we want to do is we want to just look at the symbolism and the reality of being in the desert and what the word desert means. And then we're going to get to the idea of the counting, the numbers that seem so important in the beginning of the book. So one idea that relates to the desert is, why was the Torah given outside of Israel? We left Egypt. One might think that we would have come into Israel, and then God would give us the Torah. But it's explained that it happened in the Midbar. It's called Midbar Sinai, the Sinai desert. And 2 reasons are given. One is the nature of the desert is what's called hefker, or ownerless. Because when you go to a country and you have cities and you have agricultural lands and you have villages, but many times you go out to the desert, there are not many people living there. And there's this feeling of it being wide open and as if no one owns it. It's ownerless. And so therefore, we're told that the Torah was specifically given outside of Israel in the desert, so that the message would be that ultimately the Torah was meant and is still meant for the whole world. It just happens that it was the Jewish people who first received the Torah and who observed the Torah. But the idea is that by giving it outside of Israel, the message would be that the Torah ultimately, the morals and the ethics and the spirituality of the Torah would be for everyone, and no one could claim ownership over. It's like a desert. It's ownerless. So that's one idea. That's one idea related to the desert. Now, the other idea, which is very, very interesting, because again, the whole book is called Bamidbar. And Israel spent 40 years in the desert. So the nature of the desert had a very profound effect. So the word midbar, if you change the vowels a little bit, and you said the same word, it's midaber, which means to speak. Now, this is somewhat paradoxical, because if anyone has spent time in the desert, because again, we're away from cities, we're away from agricultural, we're away from big highways. When you're out in the desert, there's this feeling of vast openness. There are very few animals out there, and there's a silence. There's an awesome silence in the desert. And yet the name of desert is midaber, the same letters as to speak. So how do we understand this? So according to tradition, many of the prophets and the patriarchs and the matriarchs, many of them, were shepherds. And they would shepherd out in the desert, or by the prophets, they would go into the desert to commune with God, to get away from civilization, where they can think and meditate and ponder. And so there's something very, very unique about the silence of the desert. But when one receives the silence, then one can speak. That's the idea here. Is, in other words, the prophets spoke in the name of God. But many of them, to prepare themselves to be able to speak, to be the mouthpiece of God, first had to integrate a deep silence. So I'm not sure if you're familiar, but this is going back like 50 years ago, but it's still a very popular song. It's called The Sound of Silence. Do you know this song? The Sound of Silence, Simon and Garfunkel. Very, very famous song, but this touched on it. What do you mean, the sound of silence? If it's silent, there's no sound. And if there's sound, there's no silence. But this is wrapped up with the mystery of the desert. The desert has this awesome silence, but that silence leads to the ability to speak. Now in Hebrew, there's a very, very special word that approximates what we're trying to say, and that's called chashmal. Now in modern Hebrew, chashmal means electricity. Electricity in Hebrew is called chashmal. But when you look at the word, it's really made up of two words, chash and mal. Chash means silent. Mal means speaking. So in one word, you have this idea of silence and speaking. So the sages said, what is this chashmal? This chashmal was part of Ezekiel's vision. If you look at the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, so he had visions of God. And in these visions, he saw an energy called chashmal. And so the sages say, well, what is this energy? They said it's angels that sometimes are silent and sometimes are speaking. So that makes sense. First you're silent and then you speak. But it's explained much deeper that it's a type of silence that you can hear. And that's how the inspiration of the song, the sound of silence. So I'll tell you a story that really exemplifies what I'm trying to say here. This happened about 25 years ago, and I led a group of students for a weekend retreat, a 3 or 4 day retreat. And we had about 120 students. And we went into the desert in Israel, a place called Mitzpeh Ramon. It's the largest natural crater in the world, Mitzpeh Ramon. Some call it the Grand Canyon of Israel. It's just absolutely gorgeous place, but it's out in the desert. And on Friday, we went hiking. And it was very hot. And so we found a place in the shade, and everyone sat down and was drinking water. And I was inspired to explain what I just explained to you. This idea of the nature of the desert being a place of great, silence, but also a place where the prophets learned to speak. And so without even thinking, I said, let's do an experiment. Let's do an experiment. Everyone get comfortable. Everyone get, in a position. No talking, no sneezing, no scraping your feet, nothing. Let's see if we can hear the silence of the desert speaking to us. And so everyone did this. It was quite amazing. Like this is like 120 people. And everyone sat absolutely still. No one moved, no one breathed, no one talked. There was no roads near there. No airplanes flew by, no birds, not even wind. Wind makes a sound. It was absolutely silent. And it was awesome. It was absolutely awesome. And it lasted for about maybe 2 or 3 minutes, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it felt like infinite. It felt like eternity, that we could actually hear the sound of silence. So all of that is to explain the idea of the desert. And the whole book of Bamidbar, of Numbers, is about the desert, the experience of being in the desert. Okay, now, what's interesting is that the numerical value of Bamidbar, of the word desert, equals exactly Avraham. Exactly Avraham, 248. And we know that Avraham was a shepherd, and he spent many, many years out in the desert. And of course, he was the first Jew. And so the fact that his name and desert equal the same thing is very significant. And both of these words, Avraham and Bamidbar for desert, equals the same as B'Tselem Elokim, which means in the image of God. Because we're told that every human being was created by God in the image of God. And here we have this idea of Avraham equaling this phrase in the image of God, but also that the desert, that this experience of the sound of silence can make one appreciate and connect to this very soul level called being in the image of God. Okay, now, having said all of that, let's look at the idea of numbers. When you look at the first portion of Bamidbar, and most of the second portion also, it's all about counting. Counting people, counting tribes, counting how they camped around the tabernacle, a whole portion. And many people is like, why do we need all of this? In other words, our belief is that the Torah is eternal and that every word, every story, every incident has eternal relevance. But how is it relevant to us? How many people were in this tribe? How many people were in that tribe? Where this tribe camped? Where that tribe camped? How many families of the Levites were they? How many were in each tribe? It's a big question. It's a big question because we have a general principle that the Torah doesn't waste any words. And it's only including things that have eternal relevance. So that is the question that we're going to address now. Because if anyone has read this chapter in English, it's like you scratch your head and like, what am I supposed to make from this? Like, what does this all mean to me now? So that's what I want to address now. Now, in English, hopefully you'll understand this. About 40 years ago, there was a famous person. His name was Marshall McLuhan. And now everyone talks about media. Everything is media. Media platforms, Facebook, WhatsApp, Telegram, everything is some kind of medium. The web, television, everything is the media. Well, he was way ahead of his time. This is going back like 50 years ago, and he made a statement called "The medium is the message." I'll say that again. The medium is the message. Now, he said this before our experience of medium, but what he understood was the way that you give over an idea or information, that becomes part of the message. In other words, the way a message is given over transmits what the message is. So therefore, if let's say today, if someone had a great idea a tremendous idea. And they created a video that was very old-fashioned, using characters that no one relates to today. And they give over their message. Well, the message is not going to get through. Everyone knows on the web, people have a very short attention span. So if that video doesn't catch your attention in the first 3 seconds, you're gone. You go on to something else. So that's what he meant. The medium is the message. The way you choose to give over an idea, that becomes not just the way you do it, it becomes the message itself. So why am I saying this? We can apply this to what's happening in this portion. Now, everyone's heard this idea that everyone has 1,000 friends on Facebook, but I have no one to talk to, right? We all have 1,000 friends, but it's not personal. It's like, I have no one to talk to. In other words, this world, the more technologically advanced it becomes, in a certain way, the more isolated people feel. Now that's crazy because we now have a global village. Look what's happening right now. I'm sitting here in Israel and I'm talking to all of you all over the world. This is a global village, and it's phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. But at the same time, more people are committing suicide. More people are taking antidepressants. More people are going out and shooting other people for crazy reasons. It's like it's both happening at the same time. So the message that the Torah wants to give over here with the counting is a simple message. Everyone counts. Everyone counts. But if the Torah would just, in one sentence, would say, and God commanded Moshe to count the people, and the total of the people were X, that the meaning would not be the message. The medium here is very repetitive, and it seems like over and over again, counting each tribe, counting according to the family, counting according to the father's house, counting the groups of tribes. But that is the message. The message is everyone counts. Now, I want to give over 2 examples that I experienced, but it makes the point. In Judaism, we have a ritual called Kiddush Levana, sanctifying the moon. Once a month, as it gets close to a full moon, we have a series of prayers that we say and statements that we make. And we go outside and everyone looks up at the moon and we say these different things. Excuse me. And one of them is, and usually you do with a large group of people, and you turn to 3 people and you say, Shalom Aleichem, and they answer back, Aleichem Shalom, like peace to you, and then they answer to you, peace. And then you turn to a second person and you say, peace to you, and they say to you, peace. Then you turn to a third person, peace to you, and to you, peace. Okay, and then you go on with the rest of the ritual. So our Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, So he had a very, very unique way to do this. And since he was very popular, sometimes when we would do this ritual called a Kiddush Levana, there'd be maybe 100 people there, maybe 200 people there. I experienced this many times. So he did something very unique. Instead of at the same time, like everyone turning to each other, and then the whole thing is over in 10 seconds. Shalom Aleichem, Aleichem Shalom. Shalom Aleichem, Aleichem Shalom. What he would do is he would have each person say Shalom Aleichem to the whole group. And the whole group would answer back. We would sing it, actually. We would sing back Aleichem Shalom. And sometimes this took a half an hour, sometimes an hour. But everyone had their chance to shine. Everyone counted. It wasn't like there are 200 people there and everyone's lost in the crowd. Everyone had their moment to shine. So it was an amazing thing. It was an amazing thing. Now, the other example, I'm sure you've all heard of the Babacher Rebbe. And in his 80s, he was like 85 years old. He began doing this every Sunday. This was in Brooklyn. He would stand and give out dollar bills, and to encourage people to then take those dollar bills and then they should give to charity. And so it became that people, you've heard the expression, people were lined up around the block. You've heard this expression, like to get into a movie or a concert, and you have tickets. And the line is very long. It goes around the block until you could get into the theater. People used to stand literally around the block waiting to approach the rabbi, and he would hand you a dollar bill. He would give you a blessing. Sometimes people would ask him a very quick question and then move on. And so this happened for about 5 or 6 years. Every Sunday, thousands of people just to be in the Rebbe's presence for about 5 seconds. People would wait hours in line in order to have 5 seconds with the Rebbe. But what was the Rebbe trying to show? He could have given $5,000 to his one of his students and say, here, give out this money and tell them from me, you should give charity. No, he wanted to be in the presence of each and every person. And people came from all over, Jews, non-Jews, religious, not religious, old, young, every race, just to be in the Rebbe's presence for 5 seconds. But it's because he wanted everyone to feel important. He wanted to be the one to give them the dollar bill. So these 2 stories I experienced myself. And that is the message of the first portion of Bamidbar, is that everyone counts. So again, if the medium is the message, and the Torah said, and God commanded Moshe to count all the people, and he counted all the people. No, here it's as if every person is being counted. But that is the message. That is the message. That's why Bamidbar means in the image of God. Everyone counts. Everyone is important. So this is a very, very important idea. And so therefore, even though when we go read it today, it seems like lots of numbers, lots of names, we have to remember what the Torah is trying to teach us. Now we're going to take it one step further, is that we see that in the counting, the way the counting happened, the way that it is, the language in the Torah is a person is counted as an individual, counted as part of a family, counted as part of a tribe, counted as a part of a group of tribes, and then counted as part of all of Israel. That's how the language is. Even when you read it in English, you see that there's levels that each person has their place on many different levels. So let's just review this. And this applies to all of us. And it's so important, because this goes what I was saying before, is that on one hand, the idea of a global village is just such a phenomenal thing. On the other hand, people feel more isolated than ever. More isolated than ever. I'm not sure if you're aware, but in the United States, approximately, let me just think for a second. It's somewhere between 1 and 200 people die every single day from an overdose of drugs. It's like, oh my gosh, it's like a plague. It's a plague, but so many of the people feel so isolated. How did they get themselves into such addiction? And a lot of it has to do with not being cut off from families, being cut off from community, being cut off from bigger goals in life. It's a real tragedy, but it's indicative of what's happening in the world. So here, again, if you even reading it in English, you'll see each one of us is an individual, and individual rights and individual responsibility and having an individual relationship with God. These are all very important, extremely important, but we're also member of families. And we all know how many people have problems with their families. It's just, what can you do? But the idea is that we're not just individuals who have no connection to anyone else. We're not, human beings are very, very social animals. Now, there are certain animals that live in small clusters, small families, and there are many animals that they're pretty much on their own. They don't connect to a bigger family units. But human beings are part of families. And families are part of communities. And there's all kinds of level of communities. There's religious communities. There are communities of people who have similar interests. Could be music, it could be sports, it could be philosophy, it could be poetry, it could be art, but people form communities around like ideas. And then you have bigger communities, you have nation states, and then we have the global village today, where beyond our being a part of a particular family or nation or race or religion. Ultimately, we're all human beings, and we're all in this together in one world. So we have the individual, the family, community, bigger communities, whether we call them religions or nation states or democracies or bigger ideas. And then we have all of humanity. And even ultimately, we have all of creation. That we are human beings, but there's a whole creation out there that we're a part of also. So there's in what's called Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, there's a famous saying from Hillel HaZaken, one of the greatest sages. And he said, Im ein ani li, mi li. If I am not for myself, who will be? In other words, the line stops here. I have to take responsibility. No one else is going to take responsibility for me. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But then he turns around and he says, V'im ani la'atzmi ma'ani. But if I'm only for myself, what am I? Like what kind of a way to live is that? That I'm like the center of the world and nothing else matters? And then he added a third thing. Im lo achshav eimatai. If not now, when? Which is such a great phrase. Like, what are we waiting for? Im lo achshav eimatai. If not now, well, when? When are you going to do it? So I'm just going to say that again. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? So that's just a great pearl of wisdom. Okay, now I want to, a few more ideas. When you read the first portion, so it talks about not only was everyone counted, but then was the arrangement, how they camped in the desert. Which tribe was on which side surrounding the tabernacle. The whole camp surrounded the tabernacle. In the middle of the tabernacle, of course, was the Holy Ark. And in the Holy Ark was the 2 tablets of the law. So this already tells us the national mission of the Jewish people. What is like the heart? The heart of the Jewish people is the Torah. But again, we ask, why do I have to know how they camped in the desert? Like, how is that relevant to me today? So, along with each tribe was camped there were 3 on each side. Imagine like a square. In the middle of the square is the tabernacle. And on each of the 4 cardinal sides, there were 3 tribes. 12 in all, 3, 3, 3, and 3. And each of the tribes had a flag. And the flag had a color and a symbol. So there is a midrash that says that when God gave the Torah on Mount Sinai, so myriads of angels came. Now remember, a midrash is a allegorical, metaphorical story trying to explain ideas. We don't necessarily understand them literally. So the Midrash says that angels came and they put 2 crowns on each person's head. One crown was because we made a statement. Before the Torah was given, we said, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will hear. Meaning, God, we don't know what's going to be in your Torah, but we trust you so much that we will do it, and then we'll come to hear, we'll come to understand what it is. But even before you give it to us, we trust it's going to be good. So we're pledging to do it, and even if we don't understand it, eventually we'll understand it, but we're going to do it anyways. So because we said, Na'aseh v'nishma, the angels came and they placed 2 crowns on everyone's head. And it said, along with that, the angels came with flags. With flags. And the Midrash says that the people looked at the flags and they said, wow, we also want flags. And God said, you want flags? I'll give you flags. Your tribes will have flags in the desert. Okay, so the question is, what does this mean? What are we being taught here? What is this flag, and why did Israel want flags so much? So the word in Hebrew for flag is degel. And the numerical value of degel equals the word, the heart. The heart. In our tradition, how do we define an angel? An angel, first of all, is an energy, and it's a messenger. An angel is a messenger. And God uses the circumstances of our lives to send us messages. These are our angels. And an angel has a purpose, just like a messenger. When someone is a messenger, he's carrying a message from one person to another. And meaning he has a purpose. So it's explained what turned the people on so much to these flags, because they could feel that the angels were full of purpose. They had purpose. And they said, we also want to have purpose. We also want these flags represented having purpose. Now, there's a very, very famous book called Man in Search of Meaning. This book was written quite a while ago by a man called Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl was in the concentration camps. And when he went in, he was still a young man. He was studying psychology. And he was working actually on his doctorate at the time. And he lived through the concentration camps. And he noticed something, and he later wrote a book about it called Man in Search of Meaning. It was a very, very influential book in its day. And what he noticed was in the camps, so the Nazis did everything they could to take away a person's humanity, to degrade a person until they didn't even feel like they were a human being anymore. And so many people lost the will to live. And he noticed that there was a certain look in someone's eye, that when someone would just they were so beaten and so, you can imagine if he could see in people's eyes where they lost the will to live. He noticed most of them didn't make it. But others, no matter how hard it was and how inhuman, they held on to a reason to live. And he found that those are the people who more likely would survive. So he wrote this whole book called Man in Search of Meaning. And he proposed this idea that this is part of the human condition, is to search for meaning. And we don't have meaning. This is really what I mentioned before about hundreds of people dying every day from overdoses. And so many times these are people who at some point they lose a purpose of why they're living. And then it's all downhill after that. And so these are these flags. And you'll read about them in the portion. It mentions these flags and the symbols on them, and they had colors. But that's the symbolism. Why are these flags so important? So that's another deep idea. And I'm going to end with one more idea, and that is, what do we learn from the encampment in the desert? That there were 3 tribes on this side and 3 tribes on this side and 3 here and 3 here. So there's a concept that we have this idea of the macrocosm and the microcosm. The idea that everything that happens in this world, there is like a mirror image in higher worlds, higher levels of reality. Like, for example, today, we talk about, let's say, string theory and 10 or 11 different dimensions. Well, we have always known this as part of our prayers, it's part of the Torah, that there are many different dimensions of reality that we don't necessarily see, but they're happening at the same time. So the idea is that things that are happening in this world represent higher ideas, higher realities. So I'm going to do this fairly quickly, but we can ask, well, where did this formation in the desert come from? Why were there 3 tribes here and 3 tribes here and 3 tribes here and 3 tribes here? So I'm going to do this quickly, but we're going to see there's a progression here. We're told that when Jacob had the dream of the ladder, hopefully everyone remembers, Jacob had a dream of a ladder with angels ascending and descending, and God appeared at the top of the ladder and spoke to him. And so we're told, though, and in the Torah it says that when he laid down to go to sleep that night, it says he put rocks around his head. We're told by tradition that he put 12 rocks around his head because in prophecy, he knew that he would have 12 tribes. 12 tribes would come from him. And how did he put the rocks? He put 3 over here, and 3 over here, and 3 here, and 3 like under him. Later, when Jacob is on his deathbed, and he tells them, he dies in Egypt, and he tells them, when I die, take me back to Israel and bury me along with my grandfather, my father, Avraham and Yitzhak. And that's where Leah is buried, my wife. And while he was on his deathbed, he told each tribe where to stand around him as his soul left the world, and that when they took the body from Egypt to Israel, his casket should be in the middle, and the tribe should be around him in the exact order that they later would be. Then the Zohar, let's go back to the dream of Jacob. When he woke up, he said, this is the house of God, and this is the ladder, the gate to heaven. So he understood that there was a connection between the lower worlds and the higher worlds. So why did he put the stones around his head like this? Why did he tell the tribes to walk with his body in this way? Is because we're told that just like in this world, there's what's called the physical Jerusalem, there's what's called the heavenly Jerusalem. And in the worlds above, also, there's God's throne of glory. And around the throne of glory, there are 4 archangels. In Hebrew, Michael, Gabriel, in English, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel. There's also 4 sets of angels surrounding the throne of glory. So now, and we'll add one more thing, is in the Zohar, it says that Jerusalem is built on 12 stones. And if anyone has been in Jerusalem, you know that Jerusalem is a series of hills and mountains. And all of it surrounds what's called the Temple Mount. So the Temple Mount is in the middle. And just like you have angels around the throne of glory, or the tribes around the tabernacle, so the hills surround the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So now, if we go back to the Torah portion and we're reading, this tribe is over here and this tribe is over there, all of a sudden it's like, whoa, this is connected to many, many other ideas on many, many different dimensions. So this was an introduction to the book of Bamidbar, especially the first portion with all of the numbers and all of the counting. And the rest of the book is full of very, very famous stories. Many, 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 many stories happen, as you can imagine, during the 40 years in the desert. But here, hopefully, we got an idea of what the Midbar is, what the desert is, the silence of the desert, and the idea that the Torah is given in the desert, so it would be open to everyone, and the idea of not just counting, but that everyone counts.